Hey, good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your day to join us for our webinar on learning from the Fort McMurray Wildland and Urban Interface Fire. So as you'll see on our screen, there's two options that you have for audio. You can connect through your computer or you can call in through your phone. So our webinar today is from our BC Regional Adaptation Collaborative Program, or BC RAC. And what we do through BC RAC is support First Nations, local governments, public sector organizations, and industries to integrate adaptation into local planning and decision making. So this program is funded by Natural Resources Canada and the BC Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Strategy. I've included the address for our retooling website where if you look in, you can find some resources, toolkits and guides, case studies related to climate change adaptation. In the screenshot of our retooling website, you can see some of the adaptation topics that we cover, from water management to forestry to mining. In the upper corner, you'll see our subscribe button. So we have a retooling newsletter that we send out quarterly. So if you want to stay up to date with our programs, with news and events, and with funding opportunities, that's a good way to keep connected. And in the bottom corner there, you can see a link to our adaptation webinars. So we record all of the webinars that we do. So for everyone who's registered, you'll be getting an email notifying you when that video is available. And some logistics for our webinar. We keep everyone's audio muted just to limit any background noise. If you want to ask questions, you can type that into the question box, but we'll be saving the Q&A until the end of the presentation. And if you come across any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can either try to talk to us through the question box, or you can send an email to my colleague Jim Vanderwall at fraserbasin@gmail.com. So today, I'm really pleased to be able to introduce our speaker, Alan Westhaver. Alan's the owner of ForestWise Environmental Consulting, which is based in Fernie, BC. He served the Canadian National Park Service as a senior wildland fire manager at the park, regional, and national levels for nearly 25 years, and he has a long-standing passion for the wildland-urban interface fire problem and joined Canada's go-to source of its information, the Partners in Protection Association, in 1990. He's been part of that organization either as a director, executive, or a member ever since. And in 1999, he co-chaired the project that coined the term FireSmart and produced the FireSmart Protecting Your Community from Wildfire Manual. And since retiring from his career with Parks Canada, Alan has been sponsored by the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction to conduct investigations into aspects of home loss at recent disasters in Slave Lake, Kelowna, and Fort McMurray. He has degrees in forestry and wildlife biology from the University of Montana, his Master of Science degree from the University of Calgary, focused on managing wildlife and wildfire in the wildland-urban interface. And speaking of the research that he did in Fort McMurray, if you look into the handouts in your control panel, you'll be able to download that specific article. So at this point, I'm going to switch the presenter over to Alan.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you to the Fraser Basin Council for the opportunity to present the webinar on this subject. I look forward to your questions at the end of the proposal or at the webinar, And if any of you are interested in ongoing communications, that's great too. I understand we have a very large and diverse audience today, and it's rewarding to know there's such a high level of interest. This topic has been a passion of mine for many years. I got my start, I guess, in this field back in the late 1980s. Our goal in national parks at that time was to reintroduce fire into park ecosystems. We had a strong science basis for doing that, and we were building the capabilities and the skills, but it soon became clear that senior managers were quite hesitant to sign off on many of our planned ignition prescribed burns when key facilities in the parks, communities, developments were at apparent risk from wildfires. So in order to get on with the real job, it was important and critical to provide those developed areas with a high level of protection first. So I've been heavily involved in the wildland urban interface ever since. And I remain optimistic that collectively there's lots that we can do to reduce losses from future incidents. I'd like to begin the presentation this morning.
Sorry, Alan, I just wanted to mention that we can't see your presentation slides yet.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. Are you able to see them now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
starting with the blank. Okay, hopefully no more. So I'd like to begin the seminar this morning by carefully characterizing the wildland urban interface fire problem. And that's an important step to frame the problem before we set to work at solving it, something that if anyone's ever taken a course by Marty Alexander, Canadian Forest Service in fire behavior, that's a key step, and he's right about that. Firstly, it's important to recognize that the problem is one that lives in many places. It's dictated by conditions. For example, at the regional and landscape level, we have to deal with topography and many different types of fuel. In communities and towns, each has their own situation in narrowing down to the neighborhood level, and particularly to residential or commercial properties. Conditions at all of those levels dictate the problem. Secondly, it's important to recognize that wildland fires spread quickly and for long distances. In doing so, they cross a lot of boundaries, and they involve consequently a lot of different responsibilities, whether it's public agencies or private individuals have a role to play in this issue. Fourth, these fires are neither a traditional wildland fire or a structural fire. And it's important to note that. So because of that, they require different solutions and tactics and strategies and training. Fifth, there's little or no time to react in these situations. And one of the key things that has been learned is that the outcome of wildland fire events is primarily dictated by the risk mitigations that are taken long before the fire begins. So that points to the great need for being proactive. And kind of the consequences of all these things, that this problem is multidisciplinary. It requires many different types of solutions. These range from prevention to response to risk mitigation and even recovery at the end of the day. And it also involves people with many different skills working in many different areas to address these. And these are the things that past wildland fire disasters have been telling us. But I may take the position that it's premature to say that these are lessons that we've really learned or taken to heart at this point in time. Also, I think it's a good place to start is to take a historical perspective on these kinds of events. The first slide here is, this is my newly adopted hometown of Fernie, British Columbia, as it looked at the end of the day on August 1st in 1908. And a wildland fire, small fire, swept into town, and within the span of 1.5 hours, completely incinerated the town with the exception of about 37 structures. Fernie at that time was a population of 5,000 people, much the same as it is today. And then we can also look at Fort McMurray in 2016, and no one needs to be reminded of the outcome of that fire. And I think despite everything that has changed in 100+ years, the outcomes of these two fire events are surprisingly similar. And despite all the things that we've learned, all the technology we've developed, the information that we have, the science, the regulations, the codes, we are facing similar outcomes. And you would think that there would be a greater contrast. So I'd also like to put forward that if we're going to achieve a better outcome, we must make some major changes in our approach. I think we would all agree that disasters of this nature are unacceptable, that we can't continue to add zeros to the solution and to endure the suffering and the losses that take place. So I'm a firm believer that it's not incremental change that needs to take place, but exponential change. In the photo on the left-hand side of this slide, one that I took in Fort McMurray of the remains of a gym in someone's home, you can see that the heat of the fire actually bent the iron bars on the weight machine. And I think that's pretty symbolic of what we need to do. We can't solve this problem just by raising the bar. We need to bend it entirely. And I'm often reminded of the words of William Fernie, the founder of the city of Fernie, as he spoke in 1908. And he spoke at that time of this fire will contain many lessons to others in this respect. And I think that's really the challenge that we face. Will we learn from past disasters? And will the Fort McMurray fire and the incredible fire season in British Columbia of 2017 be the motivating factor to move us ahead? So I think in many ways, if we revisit that list, these are ways that we need to reframe the problem, the things that we need to appreciate the situation that we're in, if we're going to avoid repeating history. And hopefully this perspective will help trigger some of those changes. So the overall goal of my presentation today is to make the case for mitigating risks, being proactive as a key solution to this wildland-urban interface problem. Going to walk you through, I'd like to summarize some of the science, some of the lessons that we can learn from past literature and experiences. I will present some of the key findings from my investigation at Fort McMurray, and I'd like to close by offering a solution, a way that we can become engaged in more widespread and effective risk mitigations, and close with a challenge to local fire departments as to how they might become the catalyst locally for wildfire reduction efforts by a literal army of wildland urban interface residents. So onwards with some of the lessons learned. I think we have a very traditional definition even of what the wildland urban interface is. Traditionally, it's basically, we've been describing it as where the forest meets the home, and thinking about developments that are either surrounded or on the edge of forested areas. But there is a much more useful and I think descriptive definition that will be helpful in guiding us forward, and that is the presence of structures in locations, any locations, where the conditions result in the potential for ignition of structures from the flames, the radiant heat, or the firebrands, the embers of wildland fires. I think this is a much more helpful definition. And of course, a wildland fire that begins to consume structural fires, man-made fuels, structural fuels, it's at that point that we really are dealing with a wildland-urban interface fire. And of course, we know that these fires can occur in almost any time of year, and they have literally occurred in all months. They're not temperature dependent, but any time of year when the humidity is down, the winds are up, and the fuels are dry, can trigger the conditions for disastrous fire. And it's worthy to note that both, how early in the year last year's BC fire season began, and the Fort McMurray fire itself, early in May already, long before the beginning of the traditional fire season. These are not a new issue by any means. Going back, there's been many, many fires in history. Another important lesson to be learned and to recognize is that literally there are no fire suppression systems. No agency is well enough prepared to stop a large conflagration fire, an urban conflagration, once it's rolling. Again, the outcome depends on the actions, the risk mitigations beforehand, and we've learned in many continents, in many places, that although fire trucks and equipment and response is extremely important, they're not the total answer. What's really lacking here is the engagement of people, working with people, building those partnerships between agencies and people on the ground. These are well underway in many locations, but this is where our strength lies in our future. Another key lesson that needs to be absorbed is the fact that there's a much literature and many examples to show that the real ignition source for homes, the vital piece of the picture that doesn't draw much attention from the media and is still growing amongst our professionals, is that embers, firebrands, are the ignition source for well over half of the homes destroyed. In some studies, it's reaching 80–90%, and some have even believe that it potentially could be 100%. And the characteristics of embers, the fact that they are incredibly numerous, they are windborne, their ability to travel long distances, and literally form a blizzard of ignition sources that accumulate, has to be appreciated. Fire does not roll into a community like a lava flow or an avalanche that overwhelms everything. Fires begin and burn according to the laws of combustion, and that means that fire moves from one object to another, and the great carriers of fire are embers. Perhaps one of the most important things that has been learned over time, we're looking at a photo of the fire as it moved into Slave Lake in 2011. is really, how do these disasters evolve? And there is a well-defined sequence that has been characterized and observed in many places and many times. In fact, a large study in the United States of 14 of the largest fires that destroyed between 100 and 1,000 homes, all evolved in a similar way, exhibiting this pattern. And this diagram is the best representation that I found of that pattern, the disaster sequence. The top three panels display conditions. that are common to these situations. First of all, we have the evolution of severe fire conditions. The combination of fuel weather, all of those things are ripe for conditions. The middle panel, there is a source of ignition. A wildland fire is burning. We all know that 95% of our fires are suppressed when they're very small and don't do much harm. They don't account for much area burn. But it's the other 5% that are spreading very rapidly with high intensity under extreme conditions that generally give us the problem. When those fires do come into contact with developed areas, top right-hand panel, the issue is that many homes ignite in a relatively short period of time. Those homes are susceptible to ignition. They're vulnerable. They're not resistant to fires, and either flames, radiant heat, or embers result in their ignition. That leaves us with a situation of many structural fires. The bottom row is the consequences. When those conditions evolve on the edge of interface communities, firefighting resources, no matter how many there are or how capable they are rapidly diluted and spread around. In many cases, it's not safe for firefighters, for their health, or for safety reasons to deal with those events. And fires begin to spread from one structure, one home, to another. This is the beginning of what we call an urban conflagration fire, and it's through this process that many homes are destroyed in a relatively short period of time. The other half, the flip side of this coin, is that there is a weak point in this disaster sequence, and that is top right corner. If multiple homes are not vulnerable, if more homes are resistant to ignition primarily by embers, then our firefighting resources are much more effectively used and capable of dealing with small numbers of situations. This is the weak point in that sequence. So what's our best approach for dealing with that sequence? It's FireSmart. FireSmart simply means the principles, practices, and programs for reducing interface fire losses. There are 7 disciplines in FireSmart concept. They're listed here, and behind door number 2 there, public education and communication. This is where people and landowners, homeowners learn about the factors that yield risk, identify those factors, and reduce those risks one factor at a time. Another key concept is that for addressing hazards in the wildland urban interface is the concept of the structure ignition zone, the home ignition zone. 3 concentric areas where we focus those risk mitigations on various aspects of the home and the vegetation surrounding it, primarily the vegetation within 30 meters. This concept has recently been refined. There's one more concentric level or circle, and that's a zone of from 0 to 1.5 meters around the home, which is essentially to be a flame-free zone. So the bottom line is that we must address the root issue, and that is the ignition potential of structures, of homes that are highly susceptible. We must increase their resistance to ignition, and that means dealing with factors of the home and the combustible materials around the home. Our friend from the U.S. Forest Service, Jack Cohen, puts it pretty succinctly. If the homes don't ignite, they can't burn. And if homes don't burn, then disaster is avoided. It's pretty short and sweet, but that's a good message. The other lesson that is to be learned, and we know for a fact, is that there's many small actions that make a big difference, particularly when we're targeting those hazard mitigations close to home. They're relatively cheap. They're easily accomplished by residents. They're not very time consuming. And what people are doing when they tackle these is that they are finding and eliminating those little pathways that carry flames to home. There's lots of evidence to tell us that these risk mitigations work. They began way back in the 60s just with incidental observations, and through the course of more sophisticated modeling, fire engineering, right down to the point of building and burning homes in controlled conditions. We know that these work. And it's surprising that little quote down in the bottom right here, that high percentage of homes without flammable roofs and 10 meters of clearance will survive a wildfire. This is a rule of thumb that was developed in the early 1970s, but still, there's lots of room to grow in that direction. Kind of last but not least is that we need to recognize that this is just not a fire physics problem. I like to characterize it by being it's 50% human behavior and 50% fire problem. So we need to lean very much on the social science literature, and there's a mountain of it, that tell us the reasons why people don't apply FireSmart practices. No matter how effective they are, if people don't believe in them, if they don't apply them, they're not going to work. So we need to be thinking about those aspects as well. So what's in the future? Well, I think you could sum it up by saying that there are three major trends. The effects of climate warming on fire intensity, the length of our fire seasons, the growing amount of development in the wildland urban interface is widespread right across the country, particularly in places like British Columbia and Alberta. And forest health issues, some of them compounded by climatic conditions, but a good example is the mountain pine beetle outbreak and other insects and diseases, which are just simply adding more fuel to the problem. All of these give us reason to believe that this problem could become and will become much more problematic in the future. So with that as kind of background, I'd like to shift now to talking about results from my investigations in Fort McMurray. And I want to begin that by, first of all, acknowledging the people of Fort McMurray and the people of all throughout British Columbia who were heavily impacted and are still suffering from the disruption of this type of fires. This has to be the reason that we move forward with solutions. And in no way was the study at Fort McMurray or the investigation I did at Slave Lake and Kelowna, post-fire investigations aimed at placing blame. However, these events do provide us with incredible opportunities for learning and avoiding them in the future. So that's was the objective. I'd like to acknowledge the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction, an institute founded by the insurance industry, primarily a research group. Their premise is that all types of natural disasters have some preventable element, and among these, fire is probably the leading one that can be mitigated. So they are really focused on research and communicating and risk mitigation. So a little bit of background as to how this study came about. In the United States and Australia, there are dedicated fire teams of fire researchers, really, that are on standby, ready to go to locations where disaster fires have potential. They're on site before losses begin, and their objective has been to learn formally In this case, we don't have that capability yet in Canada. I'm hopeful that we will someday soon. But the thoughtful folks at ICLR, watching the events of Fort McMurray unfold on their television screens and on YouTube, they observed that not all homes were being destroyed. And they wondered aloud whether there was a difference between the homes that were surviving and the ones that were being lost. They gave me a call and asked whether or not, if I thought I could put together a methodology that would answer that question. So I had a couple of days to consult with colleagues. Many thanks. A shout out to Steve Taylor at the Canadian Forest Service for his great thoughts, to look into some of the literature and some of the other investigations, more formal investigations. And 4 days later, I was on my way to Wood Buffalo, regional municipality of Wood Buffalo and Fort McMurray. The province of Alberta and the municipality had given their consent to ICLR for the study, and put me under the wing of Alberta Agriculture and Forestry as my host and liaison. And I reported daily to them throughout my time there, and sat in and was part of and checked in with the incident command almost on a daily basis. So the key question was, why did some homes survive with little or no damage while others did not? And you can see that that quickly leads to many other questions linked to the fire. And this investigation was also an opportunity to look into some of those. With regards to methods, there is a well-defined system for identifying hazard factors. There are approximately 20 well-defined hazard factors that contribute to the vulnerability of homes in the wildland-urban interface. Each of those has recommended solutions and guidelines. I used that hazard assessment system as the kind of the backbone for assessing conditions at homes that had been burned, as well as homes that had survived the fire. I made minor addition or two to those factors to help recognize the role of embers. That system is reasonably dated, dates back to the late 1990s, and so that was necessary. And that hazard assessment system was used both surviving and homes that were destroyed. So it was kind of retrospective. It was a unique application to apply this system to homes that have been destroyed, but I think I'm pretty confident that with understanding of how homes are built, constructed, there was plenty of evidence to deduce the conditions, the pre-fire conditions in relation to these hazard factors. That system involves looking at structural factors from top to bottom of the home itself, looking at a category we call ignition site factors. These are the miscellaneous combustibles that are on or around homes. There are literally thousands of different items that could fall into this category, and attachments to homes, and something we call ember accumulators. These are places that accumulate those wind-driven embers, allowing them to become even more effective igniters, nooks and crannies in homes. And another category, key category, is the vegetation fuels that are around the home. This very much relates to wildland fire behavior, to combustion. You know, how much this fuel is, where is it, how contiguous is that fuel, and how does it result in the spread of fire? And it looks not only at native plants surrounding the community, or still surviving within the community, but very much at the landscape vegetation. And of course, topographic factors are considered as well. Unique to Fort McMurray was the ability, very thoughtful people, kind of a master stroke of ingenuity. In their realty records, all homes have been documented with large scale, very detailed aerial photography. And very quickly after the fire, those photos were retaken. So they allowed me to verify some of my thoughts about existing vegetation, structures, conditions around homes pre-fire. That was the unique advantage that I had going for me. The study area itself, just like the definition, I was looking very much at all of the potential ignition sources, but primarily I was focused on the parts of the community, of the city and neighborhoods where wildland fire made that transition from forest fuel to the urban fuels and first became established. So generally this was within, from the outer ring of homes to 3 or 4 blocks within homes, within the city and neighborhoods. I also looked at Separate Creeks, which is more of a country residential acreage type area, and conducted some investigations there. But by and large, I avoided the zone where clearly fire was moving from structure to structure, as not being germane to this particular study. So looking at the study area, the primary way that I chose was to find locations where there were side-by-side examples of homes where one had survived, one had not, and try to find paired locations where these homes are of similar age or similar design, similar structure, had same characteristics, and also had been exposed to similar characteristics to the fire and heat and embers. And I did that, found those pairs in both the rural and the urban situation. There's examples of both here in the slides. There are some other situations that also and I spent some time and attention to, and one of those was urban neighborhoods that were exposed to extraordinary amounts of heat, very, very dense accumulations of embers, up to, I was getting counts of burn holes in various parts of homes and furniture of up to 600 burn holes per square meter. Gives you an indication of how abundant embers really are. So I looked at those neighborhoods that were right on the very edge but had survived, did not ignite. Lots to be learned in places like that. I also looked at isolated homes that had burned well within neighborhoods that were otherwise undamaged. And I looked at the kind of the converse of that, so-called miracle homes that survived in the midst of massive destruction. It's important to point out that there are many limitations on the study. I was not there when the homes were burning or igniting. Because there's only one of me, the sample size is relatively small. And some of the evidence was erased. I don't think that impacted in a negative way. Probably actually would have made the differences between burned and unburned even more distinct. So I'd like to review some of the conclusions from my investigations. So overall, I think it's very worthwhile to point out that results of the Fort McMurray investigation mirrored the results of numerous other even more detailed studies in the US and Australia, and a lot of the research that's been done related to wildland urban interface fires in both Canada and the United States. First and foremost, I think it's very clear that surviving homes or groups of homes and the surrounding ignition homes were significantly less vulnerable to ember ignition than homes that were destroyed. That is, that they were rated low in those with regards to those 20 different hazard factors. And that was true in all of those situations I described, in any way that I looked at the data, whether it was pooled or individually in the urban and country residential areas. And so, you know, kind of the corollary to that conclusion is that by adopting FireSmart practices, homeowners or those homes where FireSmart practices were very evident were strongly correlated to home survival. On the other hand, there were some anomalies. That is, that there were homes that were rated as having low hazard, but were destroyed, and vice versa. And in all of those anomalies, I think those come down to really kind of peculiarities within the hazard system itself. You know, it's not able to detect things like critical weaknesses. Even in homes that are very fire smart, a critical weakness can lead to the ignition of that home. And I kind of, the old Achilles heel effect. And in other cases, I think that the system kind of overestimates the amount of hazard by piling on big numbers beyond 30 meters from the home. I think a lot of studies are starting to find that it's the vegetation within 30 meters of the home that is most influential. I think there's no question that recommended FireSmart guidelines, even in, you know, I would call Fort McMurray the acid test. They have demonstrated their effectiveness once again. This problem of home loss or survival is not random. In fact, in all the pooled data, 85% of all the surviving homes were rated as FireSmart. That means that they received a low or moderate rating. And in looking at those matched pairs, which I think are the best comparison, virtually 95% of the time the surviving home was rated lower. And the differences were not marginal. There was a big point difference, even on average, between homes destroyed and homes that survived in terms of FireSmart points. 30 points is a lot in this hazard rating system. It's significant. I would also say that embers ignited the vast majority of homes in the Fort McMurray situation. There are very few situations where the clearance between forest vegetation and homes was inadequate, either to prevent ignition by radiant heat, which decreases very quickly over short distances, and or the fact that also the same direct flame contact. It was very difficult. I found it difficult to find situations where homes were actually within reach of forest flames. And you know, those clearances match very well with what we know from research both in Canada and the United States. There is some really good news I found. I think this will be of interest to home builders and developers and code people that are writing fire codes. It's my strong feeling that new homes are inherently much more fire smart because of the many new materials that are available, but also the materials that are seen to be preferred by homeowners. The fact that we have double pane windows and other features, like primarily because of energy conservation, we have very few openings anymore for embers to enter into homes and ignite fires. And I felt there was strong evidence to indicate that the Fort McMurray fire followed that well-known pattern, that fire wildland urban interface fire disaster sequence, not just as the city overall, but this was true in at least 3 of the major neighborhoods where big losses took place. That pattern was replicated in numerous places. From what I saw at this fire, it's very true that the weak point in this disaster sequence is the vulnerability of homes. That, in my opinion, if more homes had been resistant or been categorized as FireSmart, that there would have been fewer ignitions, and potentially that could have meant that the fire would have grown to that stage of house to house ignition, and that urban conflagration situation would have been less likely to occur or much more limited. On the other hand, there's no single mitigation measures that can guarantee survival. FireSmart is a package. We need to have overall compliance. And the flip side of that coin is that there are definitely, even in very FireSmart homes, an Achilles heel can supersede all of those other mitigations and almost guarantee ignition. A great example here, a large, highly combustible ornamental cedar or juniper placed in front of a window in a brick house would probably guarantee the loss of that home by breaking the glass and penetrating the home itself. Also, very important, when you break down where is that hazard coming from, a very high proportion of that comes from the vegetation located within 30 meters of the homes. I think it's also very important to note that more than 50% of that hazard is on account of vegetation, which we're planting and choosing to plant in locations around our home, whether it's the species that's more flammable, the location of it, the amount of it. It's not the forest surrounding us, it's not remnants of forest, it's the landscaping vegetation that we plant is accounting for a huge amount of the overall hazard. And I looking at each of those 20 factors. Where are we doing very well? Structures, we're good. We're pretty good in terms of some of the other structural factors and ember accumulators, but where we're across the board weak is in terms of vegetation. So it's helping us to focus. These are all things that are under control of the individual property owner. 2 really high risk situations that I see, I've given them nicknames, the jackpot junipers and what I call the ease of construction, of destruction. Many cases, for whatever reasons, shade or aesthetics, we're planting a lot of fuel underneath the eaves of our homes. When I see situations like that, this is kind of how I'm interpreting them. This is what I see in the field doing hazard assessments. So in virtually all situations, it seems to me that FireSmart guidelines were validated through the Fort McMurray study in all the situations, and just leave it at that. It's also pretty evident that hazard factors around individual homes also place your neighbors. When you're in a densely packed urban situation, that having a vulnerable home, sometimes that vegetation or those hazard factors are as much or even more likely to ignite your neighbor's home than your own home. So here's the challenge, at least in my opinion, is we need to shift the focus of our wildland interface programs onto attacking the root cause, and that means moving somewhat away from fighting fire, from fighting fuel around our communities and on public land far from homes, and focusing more of our energy on the homes and the neighborhoods themselves, reducing those hazard factors and increasing the resistance of structures to fires. That does a couple of things for us. That means breaking that disaster sequence and also reducing the ignition potential of individual homes. And really, this means that we need to do more by way of facilitating the things that residents can do to reduce wildfire risk at home and at the neighborhood level. And the solution I'd like to throw out there is the FireSmart Canada community recognition. One of the pillars being put forth by FireSmart Canada. It's a major program that's been launched across the country, or at least piloted, and it's shown its worth, but it's in great need of expansion and a little bit of fine tuning. What is the FireSmart Community Recognition Program? It does mirror the U.S. FireWise program. It's a citizen-led grassroots program. It operates at the neighborhood level. It's facilitated by trained fire professionals who use a little bit of their influence and information to kickstart a program that is basically handed off and run by residents who build their own plans and implement their own solutions. This program also leads to national recognition for their communities. An example here, it's an 8-step process, very cost efficient, highly effective. I'll use the city of Fernie, the success they've had in the past 18 months with 2 firefighters trained as local FireSmart representatives. They have now on board 9 neighborhoods who are working. There's a meeting of 1 fire personnel, Bruce Nelson, and 7 or 8, 9 community champions, just average citizens. But those 2 firefighters have leveraged 9 neighborhoods, which is now equivalent to 450 homes and 900 residents who are working in the span of 18 months of solutions in their own neighborhoods and enjoying it very much. So this is my hope for the future, that every fire hall, every community will have trained fire personnel working towards this in their community. I've got 20 years of experience in this myself, and I think we can be very effective in working with people and have a lot of fun doing it. So it means, us as fire departments being more adaptable, committing that support, and I think with a very small investment, we would be able to make vast, vast gains in our communities. So with that, I'd like to say thanks and open it up to questions. Over to you, Elena.
Hi, thanks so much, Alan. Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. So now we have a few minutes for questions. And I see there's a few that popped up already in the question box. The first about getting a copy of Alan's presentation slides. I want to note that in the handout section, you'll see in your control panel that we have attached the presentation slides there. So a first question from Bruce Green is, are there any training programs for local FireSmart representatives available?
At the moment, I'm not aware of any that are scheduled in Alberta or British Columbia. I'm hopeful that there will be, there are some opportunities for that to be happening. So it's not to say that there aren't some in the works. The thing to do would be to watch the FireSmart Canada website. And I know there are some people in our audience that will have something to do with the availability of these workshops. It's a 2-day workshop, and generally we're able to train 30 to 45 people at a workshop. Pretty economical, and there are many trained local FireSmart representatives out there now making a big difference in their respective neighborhoods and communities.
Mm-hmm. Good to know. Thanks, Alan. And our second question from Bill Elsner is he would like to know how FireSmart is used in the coastal forest type.
Yes, the fire behavior principles and the hazard FireSmart recommended guidelines apply in any Canadian fuel type. They are basic. You know, your situations in coastal forests do vary. Often, I think the public has a viewpoint that coastal forests are like asbestos and they don't burn, that they're not at risk. But we as fire people know that's not true. But the principles in terms of how we manage the vegetation, how we choose our species, how we break up the continuity of fuels, all apply. So I can confidently tell Bill that they are applicable. That we don't have to necessarily adapt. Although we may be dealing with different plants, we don't have to adapt the principles because you live in Newfoundland or Northern Ontario or on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm. And our next question from Roland, and he mentions it was an excellent presentation. And he asks if you have a comprehensive list of Achilles heels or more examples of that.
Yeah, there are a few, and probably the most frequent ones are the ones that I pointed out are those ornamental vegetation issues. But by and large, there are many, many different pathways that can lead to the ignition of a home. And inevitably, they will involve either different combinations of vegetation and other miscellaneous combustibles. But I think in my report, there's longer discussions. I would add to that list outbuildings, whether it's tool sheds, garden sheds, garages. Oftentimes they're not built or maintained to the same standard as our homes, although they, if they ignite, they're very close to our homes and they will spread fire to our homes. And there are oftentimes more stuff scattered around those. And so outbuildings are one of the other things that I'd point to as requiring special attention.
Mm-hmm. And Alan referred to his report, which is also attached in our handouts if you want to look into that in more detail, Roland. And I think we have time for one more question, one from Cassandra, who asks, what are your thoughts on the development permit process in municipalities where developers in the wildland urban interface areas are required to present wildfire hazard assessments and abatement strategies prior to obtaining permits?
I think that's a really good step in the right direction. Again, it allows us to look at what some of the potential issues are before we build. Like, it seems like 99% of the time we're stuck with what's built. But if the development process allows us to get ahead of that curve by avoiding and exacerbating the problem, that's a good thing. And generally, the criteria that they are looking at closely links to those same hazard factors that we're looking at. So I welcome that, and I welcome the fact that we can avoid or alter some of those developments to reduce the problem and make it safer for firefighters to enter those areas if there is a problem.
Thank you, Alan. So I recognize that we've gotten to the end of our time. It's 12 o'clock, and I know there's a few questions that we haven't been able to get to yet. If you're all right with this, Alan, is it okay if I share those questions with you in a follow-up, and then maybe we can get the responses out to everyone later on?
Sure thing. If there's common questions or if people wish to contact me, I'll do my best to follow up on those conversations. And again, thanks to all.
Okay, great. Well, a huge thank you to you, Alan, for putting together this presentation and your time and efforts into this. I think you've shared some really valuable lessons during this webinar, and we appreciate you being here this morning.
You're welcome.
All right, and thanks to everyone who took the time to listen in today. If you have any other questions for Alan, you can type them into the question box, and then I'll follow up with everyone afterwards. And thank you, and enjoy the rest of your